The old woman's hands were trembling as she held the photograph, tears streaming down her weathered face. "Marcus, my boy. I knew you'd come back," she whispered, not recognizing the homeless-looking man standing in her doorway as the tech billionaire who had disappeared from Silicon Valley 5 years ago. But what Marcus discovered in that dusty attic box would shatter everything he thought he knew about his identity, his fortune, and the mother who had raised him. The DNA test results weren't just shocking. They revealed a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of corporate America, and the truth about why someone had been trying to kill him for the past decade. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found in bank accounts, but in the secrets buried in our past. If stories about family secrets and hidden truths touch your heart like they do mine, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Your support means the world to me, and I'd love to hear in the comments if you've ever discovered something about your family that changed everything. Now, let me tell you Marcus's incredible story. One that will make you question everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and the price of success. Marcus Chin had been walking for 3 days straight when he finally reached the familiar street corner where his childhood home stood. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, worth over $2 billion according to Forbes, looking like he hadn't eaten in weeks and carrying everything he owned in a battered backpack. The designer stubble had grown into a full beard, his clothes were dirt-stained and torn, and his once perfectly manicured hands were now calloused and rough. It was exactly how he wanted it. For 5 years he had been Marcus Chin, the wunderkind CEO of Technova Industries, the man who revolutionized artificial intelligence and made investors billions. But that life had become a prison of board meetings, hostile takeovers, and constant threats. The final straw came when his penthouse apartment was broken into for the 3rd time in 6 months, and his security team found listening devices planted throughout his home. So Marcus Chin died, at least on paper. A carefully staged sailing accident off the coast of Monterey, complete with Coast Guard search and rescue operations that found nothing but debris from his yacht. The media mourned the loss of the brilliant young entrepreneur, while Marcus himself watched the news coverage from a small motel room in Nevada, having transferred his assets to offshore accounts and assumed a new identity. For 5 years he had lived as Michael Carter, working odd jobs across the country, sleeping in shelters, and discovering a world that his billions had never allowed him to see. He learned what it meant to be invisible, to depend on the kindness of strangers, and to find joy in the simplest things, a warm meal, a comfortable bed, or just a conversation with someone who saw him as human rather than a walking dollar sign. But now, standing on Maple Street in the small Indiana town where he grew up, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years: nervousness. The white 2-story house looked smaller than he remembered, its paint peeling and garden overgrown. His adoptive mother, Eleanor, was now 78 years old, and according to the private investigator he'd hired to check on her periodically, she was struggling financially despite the trust fund he'd set up before his death. She had refused to touch the money, telling the lawyers she didn't deserve anything from a son she'd failed to understand. The guilt had eaten at him for 5 years, but he'd convinced himself it was better this way. Better for her to think him dead than to live in constant fear of the people who wanted to destroy him. The front steps creaked under his weight, just like they had when he was 12 years old, sneaking back into the house after spending hours at the library teaching himself computer programming. Eleanor had never understood his obsession with technology, but she had supported it anyway, working double shifts at the diner to buy him his first computer, his first programming books, and eventually to help him get to MIT. She had been the only parent he'd ever known, taking him in when the state couldn't find any relatives after his birth parents died in a car accident. Eleanor Martinez had been a 35-year-old single woman working as a waitress, with no experience raising children and barely enough money to take care of herself, but she had seen something in that scared 8-year-old boy and decided to give him a chance. When he knocked on the door, Marcus's heart was pounding so hard he was sure the neighbors could hear it. The woman who answered was frielier than he expected, her once vibrant dark hair now completely gray and her brown eyes dimmed with age, but her smile was exactly as he remembered it, warm, encompassing, and full of unconditional love. "Can I help you?" she asked, squinting at him through the screen door. Marcus had prepared for this moment for months, rehearsing what he would say, how he would reveal himself, but now all words failed him. "Mrs. Martinez?" he finally managed, his voice cracking like a teenager's. I knew your son Marcus. Before he..." Eleanor's expression changed immediately, her eyes filling with tears as she opened the door wider. Come in," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Anyone who knew my boy is welcome here. I don't get many visitors who remember him anymore." As they sat in the living room that still smelled like the vanilla candles she'd always burned, Marcus found himself studying this woman who had shaped his entire life. The walls were covered with photographs, his graduation from MIT, his first product launch, magazine covers featuring his success. But what struck him most was a small framed picture on the side table showing him at age 10, gap-toothed and grinning, with his arm around Eleanor at his school science fair. He remembered that day perfectly. He'd won first place with a project about solar energy, and Eleanor had been so proud she'd cried right there in the gymnasium. He was such a special boy, Eleanor was saying, her voice distant and nostalgic. Too smart for his own good sometimes. Always asking questions, always trying to fix things that weren't broken. I used to worry he'd never find his place in the world, but then he went off to college and became this incredible success. She paused, wiping away a tear. I just wish I could have helped him more. Maybe if I'd understood what he was going through, if I'd been a better mother, he wouldn't have felt so alone at the end. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. All these years, he'd assumed Eleanor would be better off without him, that his dangerous lifestyle and the constant threats would only put her at risk. He'd never considered that she would blame herself for his supposed death, that she would carry the guilt of feeling like she'd failed him as a mother. Mrs. Martinez, he said carefully, I don't think Marcus ever felt alone. From what I knew of him, he talked about you constantly. You were the most important person in his life. Eleanor looked up at him with surprise, her tear-filled eyes searching his face. He talked about me? Really? The hope in her voice was heartbreaking, and Marcus had to fight back his own tears. All the time. He used to say that everything he accomplished was because of the foundation you gave him. The values, the work ethic, the belief that he could achieve anything if he tried hard enough. That all came from you. They talked for hours, and with each story Eleanor shared about his childhood, Marcus felt pieces of himself returning that he'd forgotten existed. She told him about the time he tried to build a robot out of household appliances and accidentally short-circuited half the neighborhood. She reminisced about his first job at 14, washing dishes at the local restaurant to save money for better computer equipment. She even laughed about the phase when he was 16 and decided he wanted to be a chef instead of a programmer, spending 3 months trying to perfect his grandmother's secret recipe for tres leches cake. He never did get it right, Eleanor chuckled, but he was so determined. That boy never gave up on anything once he set his mind to it. As evening approached, Eleanor insisted that Marcus, still introducing himself as Michael Carter, a friend of her son's, stay for dinner. It's the least I can do for someone who knew my Marcus, she said, bustling around the small kitchen with more energy than he'd seen from her all day. While she cooked, Marcus excused himself to use the bathroom and found himself drawn upstairs to his old bedroom. Eleanor had kept it exactly as he'd left it when he went to college. The walls still covered with posters of famous inventors and entrepreneurs, the desk still cluttered with old programming books and prototype gadgets he'd built as a teenager. But what caught his attention was something he'd never noticed before. A small wooden box tucked behind his old computer monitor, partially hidden by dust and cobwebs. Curiosity overtaking caution, Marcus pulled the box down and opened it carefully. Inside were documents he'd never seen before. Old letters, legal papers, and photographs that made his blood run cold. The top letter was addressed to Eleanor, dated just 2 months after she'd adopted him, and it was from a law firm in Chicago. As he read, his hands began to shake. The letter was informing Eleanor that Marcus's biological parents hadn't died in a car accident as she'd been told. His father, David Chin, had been a whistleblower at a major pharmaceutical company, preparing to testify about illegal drug trials when he and Marcus's mother were killed in what the police had ruled a tragic accident, but what the letter suggested was actually murder. The lawyer was warning Eleanor that there might still be people looking for Marcus, people who wanted to ensure that no loose ends remained from his father's investigation. But that wasn't the most shocking revelation. As Marcus continued reading through the papers, he found his original birth certificate, and the name listed as his biological father wasn't David Chin. It was David Zhao, and according to the attached documents, David Zhao was the brother of Thomas Zhao, the current CEO of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, one of the largest drug companies in the world. Marcus's mind reeled as the implications hit him. Thomas Zhao, the man who had been trying to acquire Technova Industries for the past 3 years through increasingly aggressive means, the man whose company had been behind several of the threats and break-ins that had ultimately forced Marcus to fake his own death, was his uncle. The hostile takeover attempts weren't just about business. They were about eliminating the last witness to whatever had happened 30 years ago. Marcus found himself sinking onto his old bed, the documents scattered around him as he tried to process this information. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his success, and even the threats against him had been built on lies. Eleanor's voice calling him for dinner seemed to come from very far away, and he realized he was in shock. His biological father had died trying to expose Meridian Pharmaceuticals, and now, 3 decades later, Thomas Zhao had discovered that his nephew, the nephew he'd probably assumed died with his parents, had become a billionaire tech mogul with the resources to potentially uncover whatever secrets David Zhao had died protecting. The pieces were starting to fit together in a horrifying pattern. The attempts to acquire Technova weren't random business decisions. They were systematic efforts to gain control of Marcus's resources and ultimately eliminate him, just as they had eliminated his father. The break-ins, the threats, the constant surveillance, it had all been Thomas Zhao's people trying to determine how much Marcus knew about his father's work and whether he posed a threat to their organization. But what chilled Marcus to the bone was the realization that Eleanor had known all of this for 30 years and had never said a word. She had taken in the son of a murdered whistleblower, knowing that it might put her own life at risk, and had raised him with love and devotion while carrying the secret that his entire existence was built on a lie. When he finally made it downstairs for dinner, Marcus found it difficult to look Eleanor in the eye. She served him the same meal she'd made every Sunday when he was growing up, pot roast with vegetables and homemade bread. But the taste brought back memories that now seemed tainted with deception. How could she have kept this from him all these years? How could she have watched him build his empire, watched him become successful, without ever warning him that his uncle was the very man who had ordered his parents' deaths? Throughout dinner, Marcus struggled to maintain his composure as Eleanor chatted about neighborhood gossip and asked gentle questions about how he'd known Marcus. Every smile, every loving gesture felt like a betrayal, and yet he could see genuine pain in her eyes when she spoke about losing him. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Here was the woman who had loved and raised him, who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities, but who had also built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies. As they finished eating, Marcus knew he couldn't continue the charade any longer. The truth was burning inside him, demanding to be acknowledged, but he also knew that revealing his identity now would force Eleanor to confront not only his deception but her own. "Mrs. Martinez," he began carefully, setting down his fork, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to promise me you'll listen to the whole story before you react." Something in his tone must have alerted her to the seriousness of the moment, because Eleanor straightened in her chair, her motherly instincts clearly sensing that something important was about to happen. "Of course, dear," she said, though her voice carried a note of apprehension. Marcus took a deep breath and reached into his backpack, pulling out his old MIT class ring, the one Eleanor had saved for months to buy him as a graduation present. Her eyes widened as she recognized it, and her hand flew to her mouth in shock. "My name isn't Michael Carter," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Marcus. I'm your son, and I'm alive, and I am so sorry for putting you through 5 years of grief." The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor stared at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to see past the beard and the weathered features to find the boy she had raised. When recognition finally dawned, she let out a sound that was part sob, part gasp, and part laugh. "Marcus? My Marcus." She reached across the table with trembling hands to touch his face, and when her fingers made contact with his skin, the dam broke for both of them. They cried together for what felt like hours, Eleanor alternating between holding him tight and pulling back to look at him as if she couldn't quite believe he was real. "I thought you were dead," she kept repeating. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Marcus found himself explaining everything. The threats, the attempts on his life, the decision to fake his death and disappear. He told her about the 5 years he'd spent living as someone else, about the guilt that had eaten at him every day, and about how desperately he'd missed her. But even as they reconnected, the weight of the documents upstairs hung between them like an unspoken accusation. Finally, when their tears had subsided and Eleanor had made them both tea with shaking hands, Marcus knew he had to address the elephant in the room. "Mom," he said, using the word that had always felt natural despite their lack of blood relation, "I found the box in my room. I know about my father, about Meridian Pharmaceuticals, about all of it." Eleanor's face went pale, and she seemed to age 10 years in that instant. "Oh, Marcus," she whispered, her voice filled with a pain that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. "I hoped you would never have to know." The story that came out over the next several hours was even more complex and heartbreaking than Marcus had imagined. Eleanor explained that she hadn't been randomly selected to adopt him. She had been David Zhao's girlfriend before he met Marcus's mother, and when David needed someone he could trust to protect his son, Eleanor had been the obvious choice. She had loved David deeply, and when he was killed, she had agreed to take Marcus not just out of kindness but out of a promise she had made to the man she had planned to marry. He was so scared in those final weeks, she remembered, tears streaming down her face. He knew they were going to kill him, and his only concern was making sure you would be safe. He made me promise that I would raise you as my own and never tell you the truth unless your life was in danger. The revelation hit Marcus like a thunderbolt. Eleanor hadn't just been his adoptive mother. She had been his father's first love, the woman who had given up her own chance at happiness to protect the son of the man she'd lost. "But why didn't you tell me when the threat started?" Marcus asked. "Why didn't you warn me that Thomas Zhao was my uncle?" Eleanor's answer was heartbreaking in its simplicity. "Because I hoped that if you didn't know, if you couldn't connect the dots, maybe he would leave you alone. Maybe you could live your life without ever having to carry the burden of what your father died trying to expose." As the night wore on, Eleanor filled in more details about David Zhao's investigation. He had discovered that Meridian Pharmaceuticals was conducting illegal drug trials on vulnerable populations, homeless people, immigrants, anyone who wouldn't be missed if something went wrong. The trials had resulted in numerous deaths, but the company had covered them up by falsifying records and bribing officials. David had spent months gathering evidence, preparing to take his findings to federal prosecutors, when his car conveniently went off a bridge during a rainstorm. The official investigation was perfunctory, the case was closed quickly, and Thomas Zhao inherited control of the company along with all of its dark secrets. "Your father was a hero, Marcus," Eleanor said, her voice filled with pride and sadness. "He could have looked the other way, could have kept his job and his comfortable life, but he couldn't stand by and watch people die for corporate profits. That courage, that moral strength, it's in you too. I've watched you build your company with integrity, watched you use your success to help others, and I know David would be proud of the man you've become." But even as she spoke these words of comfort, Marcus could see the fear in her eyes. Now that he knew the truth, now that he understood the connection between his family and Meridian Pharmaceuticals, the danger that had forced him into hiding 5 years ago would only intensify. The weight of this revelation settled over Marcus like a heavy blanket, but instead of feeling defeated, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: clarity. For the first time since he'd started Technova Industries, he understood why he'd always felt driven to use his technology for good, why he'd insisted on ethical practices even when they cost him profits, and why he'd felt such a deep connection to social justice causes. It wasn't just good business or moral posturing, it was literally in his blood, inherited from a father who had died fighting for what was right. "Mom," he said, the word carrying new weight now that he understood their true relationship, "I need to finish what my father started." Eleanor's face filled with terror at his words. "No, Marcus, please. You don't understand what these people are capable of. They killed your parents, they've been trying to kill you, and if they find out you're alive and that you know the truth." But Marcus interrupted her gently, taking her hands in his. "They're going to find out anyway. Thomas Zhao isn't stupid, he's probably already figured out that my death was suspicious, and if he hasn't, he will soon. The only way to protect both of us is to expose the truth before he can silence us permanently." The resolve in his voice reminded Eleanor so much of David Zhao 30 years earlier that it took her breath away. Over the following weeks, Marcus began carefully orchestrating his return from the dead. Using secure communication channels and encrypted networks he developed during his years at Technova, he reached out to trusted allies, investigative journalists who had been following Meridian Pharmaceuticals for years, federal prosecutors who had always suspected there was more to the company's success than met the eye, and former employees who had witnessed questionable practices but had been too afraid to speak up. The evidence that David Zhao had died trying to protect was still hidden in safety deposit boxes and secure storage facilities across the country, waiting for someone with the resources and determination to bring it to light. But Marcus's plan went beyond simple whistleblowing. Using his technical expertise and the offshore financial resources he'd accumulated during his death, he began acquiring stock in Meridian Pharmaceuticals through shell companies and proxy investors. His goal wasn't a hostile takeover in the traditional sense. It was something far more elegant and devastating. He was going to use Thomas Zhao's own greed and paranoia against him, forcing the company into situations where its illegal activities would be exposed naturally through regulatory scrutiny and media attention. The first phase involved strategic leaks to investigative journalists, carefully timed to coincide with Meridian's quarterly earnings reports and FDA review periods. As questions began swirling around the company's research practices and historical data, Thomas Zhao reacted exactly as Marcus had predicted, with aggressive legal action and public relations campaigns that only drew more attention to the very issues he was trying to suppress. The beauty of Marcus's plan was that he remained completely invisible throughout the process. As far as the world knew, Marcus Chen was still dead, and the mounting pressure on Meridian Pharmaceuticals was simply the result of good investigative journalism and regulatory oversight. As the evidence mounted and federal investigations began in earnest, Marcus found himself spending more time at Eleanor's house, helping her process not just his return but the larger implications of their shared history. They would sit for hours in the living room where she had first raised him, talking about David Zhao and the choices that had shaped all their lives. Eleanor shared stories Marcus had never heard, about his father's dedication to his research, his anguish over the suffering he had witnessed, and his desperate love for the son he knew he might never see grow up. He used to say that if anything happened to him, he hoped you would grow up to be the kind of person who would continue his work, Eleanor remembered. He wanted you to have the strength to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. The final phase of Marcus's plan came together 6 months after his return to Eleanor's house. Federal prosecutors, armed with decades-old evidence and new testimony from whistleblowers who had been inspired by the media coverage to come forward, filed comprehensive charges against Thomas Zhao and 17 other Meridian Pharmaceuticals executives. The charges included murder, conspiracy, fraud, and violations of federal drug testing regulations that carried potential sentences of life in prison. On the same day the arrests were announced, Marcus published a comprehensive website detailing the entire conspiracy, including his own family's connection to the case and the evidence that his parents had been murdered to protect Meridian's secrets. But perhaps the most powerful moment came when Marcus appeared at a press conference, revealing that he was alive and that he was David Zhao's son. Standing beside Eleanor, who had finally agreed to tell her part of the story publicly, Marcus read a statement that connected his father's work 30 years earlier to his own commitment to ethical business practices. "My father died because he believed that no amount of profit was worth a single human life," Marcus said, his voice strong and clear. "Today we honor his memory by ensuring that his sacrifice was not in vain and that the people responsible for his death finally face justice." The trial that followed became one of the most significant corporate criminal cases in American history, not just because of the severity of the crimes but because of the deeply personal story at its heart. Marcus testified about growing up without knowing his true heritage, about building a successful company while unknowingly being hunted by his own family, and about the woman who had sacrificed everything to protect him. Eleanor's testimony about her decades of silence, her fear for Marcus's safety, and her unwavering love for both the father and the son, brought tears to the eyes of everyone in the courtroom. In the end, Thomas Zhao was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Meridian Pharmaceuticals was dissolved, its assets distributed to the families of victims and to organizations working to reform drug testing practices. Marcus used his restored identity and his billions to establish the David Zhao Foundation for Medical Ethics, ensuring that his father's legacy would live on in the fight for responsible research and corporate accountability. And Eleanor, finally free from the burden of secrecy she had carried for 30 years, moved into a beautiful home that Marcus built on land adjacent to his own estate, where they could finally be the family they had always been in their hearts. If this story moved you the way it moves me every time I think about it, I want you to know that your support means everything to creators like me who believe in the power of real human stories. Please subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear about the incredible strength that can come from love, sacrifice, and the courage to fight for what's right. But more than that, I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever discovered something about your family that changed everything you thought you knew about yourself? Have you ever had to make an impossible choice between safety and justice? Share your story with our community, because every single one of us has experiences that could inspire and help others who are facing their own difficult journeys. Your voice matters, your story matters, and together we can create a space where truth and love triumph over fear and deception. Thank you for being part of this incredible community, and I'll see you in the next story.